All right, good morning, everybody. My presentation is called How Do I MBR Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. And this is a little bit of a head nod to the poem written by Elizabeth Browning, How Do I Love Thee? My name is Troy Martin, and you can find me on Twitter at TroyMart. Kind of like the Quickie Mart in The Simpsons. So my 10-minute agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about slogans, kind of messages, mantras, if you will, that we kind of use across many different areas, and then I'll pick one specific to Wi-Fi, and I'll start breaking that down. I'm going to showcase the beacon frame. We're going to deep dive into that a little bit. I'm going to remind everyone briefly about the calculator tool, and I'll talk more about that. We'll look at bits in the air, and we'll get you guys to imagine frames flying through the air like a football being passed. And lastly, I'll suggest some MBR, or minimum basic rates, that I'd recommend as guidelines for us going forward. So first off, let's talk a little bit about carrots. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard the saying, carrots are good for your eyes. But let's take a look at this and where this comes from. So it is true that carrots are loaded with beta-carotene, and when you consume them, your body converts them into vitamin A, which helps maintain good health of your eyes. But does it improve your vision? Well, in the 1940s, Britain was under attack. There were a lot of planes flying in. They were bombing the country. And so they went to a blackout kind of program where they shut off the lights at night to make it harder to see the targets. And they told the citizens in Britain not to worry, that if they ate a lot of carrots, they'd still be able to see and get around at night. And they also had to pass along this messaging because the British Air Force had recently developed new radar technology where they were able to track bombers while they're in the air. So they had pilots like John Cat Eyes Cunningham, who was successfully able to shoot down 20 bomber planes coming into the country. But they had to mask this new technology capability and pass along the message that carrots improved your eyesight. And this saying took into effect for many, many years. Also, if you guys are hardcore nutritionists, you may have heard that carrots have a high glycemic index. Now, the glycemic index is a measure of the effect of consuming carbohydrates and its effect on blood glucose levels. So basically, you take a measure of consuming 50 grams of carbohydrates, and you measure the effect on your blood. And they set it on a scale between 0 and 100. If you ate 50 grams of sugar, you'd score 100, and then everything's kind of referenced to that. And so carrots themselves score relatively high on the glycemic index. But it's because you need to consume 50 grams of carbohydrates. Now, it turns out there's roughly 8 grams of carbs in 1 cup of carrots. So to hit that threshold, you have to consume about 1.5 pounds of carrots. Now, if you're able to scarf down 1.5 pounds of carrots, you'd see an increase in your blood glucose levels. But it's unrealistic to consume that many carrots. Also, as a side note, carrots way back in the day typically ended up being purple, and the orange carrots are a mutation of the carrots. So the carrots we're eating today are a mutation of the early day carrots. Okay. So the slogan that I want to focus on my talk is disabling lower data rates. And let's break that down, see kind of what that means, and I'll look at some data points that I think it's relevant to consider when we think about this saying. So first, the beacon frame. So going back to the poem, How Do I Love Thee? It's a Petrarchan poem. It's a sonnet consisting of 14 lines. The first 8 lines make up the octet. The last 6 lines finish the poem, make up the sestet. And I realized to me, looking at this breakdown of the beacon, that the fields within a beacon are to the Wi-Fi engineer like the words are to a poet. Okay? Every bit has meaning and purpose, just like every word in a poem has meaning and purpose. Okay? And you can see in this slide that there are a lot of fields that are mandatory. They have to be there, your source and destination MAC address, mandatory components. But there's a lot of variable and variable length fields, right? A lot of amendments and additions going into beacons. So effectively, we're seeing beacon bloat as we add more features and enhancements to this. Yesterday, we saw a Human's presentation about OWE and how there's additional fields being added to the beacons, which causes beacon bloat. And we're going to look at the effect as we increase the length of beacons, what that does to our airtime utilization. Okay. So just before we go too far into that, let's talk about the calculator. I'm sure you guys are aware, if anyone who isn't, there's a SSID overhead calculator that was released by Andrew Van Nage, Revolution Wi-Fi. If you go to his website, you can download it. It's essentially a spreadsheet, but it lets you plug in a data rate, you define the length of the beacon frame, and you can calculate the airtime consumption used by the beacon frame alone. And to make this a little bit easier for us, Ryan Adzema has coded an iOS app that you can download on your phones, and you can run this application. So while you're sitting in meetings with customers and trying to explain to them the effects of beacons on their airtime utilization, you can show that to them directly. Okay. Now, in Jim's presentation earlier in the week, he suggested that every good presentation needs a line graph. So this is my gratuitous, or the first of many gratuitous line graphs. And here you can see what I'm tracking. I just have 2 access points that are operating on the same channel. And I'm considering 3 SSIDs. So I believe you should be able to get pretty much everything you need to do with 3 SSIDs, ideally fewer than that, but about 3 SSIDs, you should be able to accomplish a lot. The line across the top shows the airtime utilization of 1 megabits per second. Okay, and the bottom line show 11 megas per second, and then the 6, 12, and 24 for both 802.11g and 802.11a. And what I want to show out of this slide is that there's significant airtime at 1 megabits per second, but as we drop down to those other rates, there's almost no difference or very little difference between those rates. We're looking at 1 or 2% of airtime, right? So the difference between going from a 6 to a 12, you're effectively saving very little bit. If we look at this slide, and we talked about, Ben Miller talked about airtime utilization. And so in this model, I'm theoretically predicting the airtime utilization. Where if you looked at pure utilization and took some metrics about that, it could be a little bit misleading. So these are just theoretical calculations. And again, with 3 APs hearing each other in the same channel, again, very little difference if you flip between 6, 12, or 24 as your lowest data rate. If we go up to 4 APs, significant impact on airtime utilization with 1 megabit per second, but if we keep holding on to those lower data rates, we don't see the same effect. And here's also a little bit of model. So this is just 1 access point in a hotel room. And so with a lot of these design tools, you can play around with the colors to make it more exciting. The red here, the boundary of the red represents a neg65 size cell. But where it turns gray, that's the difference between neg87 and neg91. And if just the particular AP that I'm modeling in this case, that neg87 and neg91 corresponds to the difference between the 6 and the 24 megabit data rate. So that space in gray is the difference in my cell size, right? So effectively, I'm not really changing the propagation distance or shrinking the size of my cell by picking 6 or 12. Okay, we saw in the previous slides, there isn't much of an effect on the airtime utilization by choosing one of those data rates. If you were listening carefully during Eddie's shark fruit presentation, his tip number 2 was to pick columns that matter. Right, so when you're doing your Wireshark captures, you can capture and filter on beacon intervals or beacon times, the time it takes to transmit the beacons through the air, and you can filter and you can look at that. And Adrian also showcased that within his tool, Wi-Fi Explorer, you also had the ability to visualize in real time how much airtime was being consumed by different beacons. And so this graph is showing for those various data rates, on the left-hand side, how much airtime is being consumed in microseconds for various beacon lengths. Okay? And this, you can also imagine that if you took that football that I was talking about earlier, when you're hurling that football, this is how many milliseconds that football, that frame is staying in the air, preventing other devices from talking. So as those beacons grow and they consume more airtime, then we may want to reduce the content or the information that's in these beacon frames. So how can we do this? One, maybe we want to disable the AP host name. You know, potentially, depending on how long your host name's in, that could save 10% of your beacon length. Okay? If we're not using 802.11ax, we don't have those clients out, and we happen to purchase an 802.11ax AP, maybe shut off those capabilities and those data rates. We could disable QoS. We could shut off RSN, the robust security networks, right? That's going to consume extra bandwidth. We could disable OOE, or also a bunch of additional information elements. Now, really, those are silly examples, silly things what we could do, okay? I'm not being serious with those. But what would really help us is we just left the data rates alone and we design co-channel interference out of our networks. That would lead us to much more success. So the data rates that I'm suggesting, instead of saying 11B is dead, I just think it makes me feel really sick to my stomach if I leave 11B turned on. I'm suggesting we maintain 6 as the lowest data rate. You can also enable 24 as your highest minimum or highest mandatory basic rate. And if you're going to do that, why not turn on 12? Okay? And so just to leave you guys with a poem that Elizabeth Brownlee wrote, to inspire you guys, think about what you're passionate about. Some of you may be passionate about your spouse, significant others, your pets in your life, but some people are passionate about co-channel interference. Thank you.